In this video I want to pay homage to my violin teacher Ronaldo de Lima, named after shares the same name as the famous Brazilian footballer of the 90s, Ronaldo. Anyway, Ron de Lima wasn't a famous violinist, but rubbed shoulders with famous violinists. So had famous violinists as teachers, did master classes with famous violinists such as Ricci, and churned out hundreds, maybe thousands of students, many of which reached grade 8, and to his great credit, even in schools in really rough areas like the Lakes Estate of Milton Keynes, Ron was able to produce grade 8 students from poor working class backgrounds. So what an accomplishment that is. And Ron left a massive influence on me, and of course influenced me to become a lifetime Jascha Heifetz fan, and also introduced me to many other violinists. And Ron was present in my life here and there at various points since the age of 4. So yeah, this video is not about a famous person, but it's about someone who I think was important for me, and I'll explain why as I go through the video. So, not sure, Ron may well have produced some professional musicians. He did have a student who did become famous, and that's one of the girls who was on the set of EastEnders, but I can't remember which one it was, but she was one of Ron de Lima's students as well. Ron was born in Goa in the 1930s, which makes it an interesting time and place to be living. India under the British Raj, I guess Goa under the Portuguese rule still, and obviously living through the threat of Japanese invasion during World War II, and also living through the horrors of partition in 1947, which affected Goa as well. I remember Ron giving a story where his dad was surrounded by these Hindu thugs, and he pulled out his Christian cross and showed it to them, and that's the reason why they didn't kill him. So yeah, an interesting time to be growing up in an interesting exotic place. His dad, I think, had been schooled in England, so they were Anglicans, I guess, religion-wise. Ron was in none other than the famous Zubin Mehta's class at school. He was a classmate of Zubin Mehta, I think, in primary school. His dad was a medical doctor, and his dad was an avid Jascha Heifetz fan who had seen Heifetz in performance, and I believe Ron's uncle had also seen Heifetz in performance, I guess, either in London, or perhaps when Heifetz was passing through, maybe in the 30s, perhaps performing in Bombay. I don't exactly know how Ron's folks got to see Heifetz in performance. And of course Ron grew up listening to Heifetz on the radio over there in Goa. He had musician siblings. I believe his sisters were pianists, or one of them was a pianist. Piano didn't work out for Ron. His parents tried to put him on the piano, it just wasn't his thing. The violin he took to immediately as a child, so they quickly figured out that the violin was the way forward for Ron. That was the instrument he gravitated to. Now, Ron family would have come to London, I guess, in the 1950s, and Ron continued his violin training, but didn't have a clear-cut career path at that point. So instead he decided to go into the Royal Navy, which was an interesting chapter in his life. He saw active service in Aden. He spoke about a guy who had a music shop full of classical LPs, Bikasji, Wakasji, or some kind of strange Middle Eastern name, and wherever that was that Aden, was that somewhere in the Middle East where Ron was stationed with the Navy. And this guy apparently knew how to access every LP. You know, if you said, I want a Zigeti recording of the Brahms, it was like, you know, a fifth shelf up. And he knew exactly on the shelf where that LP was. This guy had an amazing grasp of his own catalogue of LPs in his shop. That's just a little side story. So Ron travelled the world pretty much. He had a big shell in his house from somewhere he'd been, I think, probably in UK based in the Caribbean or maybe in the South Pacific, I don't know. He related some stories from time in the Navy, including a quite a horrible story of a guy being beaten up by these other Navy guys whilst he was asleep and things like that. But Ron managed to duck and dive, and I believe he joined sort of the group of musicians in the Navy and would perform light music, would play on violin for you know, for the officers or to entertain the Navy guys or whatever. So after the Navy, Ron then began to resume his violin studies, and I think pretty much would have got his teaching diploma in violin, and also his teacher training course, became a qualified music teacher. And that was then the career that he pursued, teaching violin music in schools, initially in London, and then an opportunity came up in Milton Keynes, and he would have moved to Milton Keynes around the time probably that we did, very early 1980s, around that time. Certainly I first went to Ron for violin lessons at the age of 4 when I lived in Springfield, Milton Keynes, and that would have been, 1981. So I guess he was already there by then. But as well as getting those qualifications in the violin, Ron pursued private lessons with, I think it's Colin Sawyer. Also Isolde Menges, that's a noteworthy violin teacher, because she was in the Leopold Auer class. She was famous and a very gifted violinist. She rubbed shoulders with Jascha Heifetz in the Leopold Auer class, and I've done another video on a story with when Heifetz was messing about with the ball in class, and Auer chastised him and then got him to perform in front of the class, and then Heifetz sort of blew everyone over. So check out my other video on that story if you're interested in it. So he went to Isolde Menges. He also went to Alfredo Campoli and associated with Campoli throughout the rest of Campoli's life, even caring for Campoli while Campoli was in hospital. So yeah, sort of from the point of meeting Campoli for his private lessons, then a lifelong association with him. Alfredo Campoli also taught him composing, and taught him all, Ron went through all of the Paganini caprices with Campoli and so on and so forth. I actually have some sheet music that has Campoli's writing on it, the introduction of Rondo Capriccioso, and the Fiocco Allegro also has Campoli's markings on it. So although they're copies that Ron gave me, they're prized possessions for me. And then there was another Jewish violinist in London that he had lessons with, and I can't remember his name. Maybe it'll come back to me. It's just a shame, I should have written it down. And possibly Ron might have had some other lessons with other famous violinists as well. As well as that, he attended masterclasses with Ruggiero Ricci at Dartington and masterclasses with others. Ron didn't marry. He had a lifelong passion for violin. He was totally absorbed in the subject. It was his whole life and his whole passion. So as well as playing the violin, performing, leading orchestras, teaching in schools and giving private lessons, attending master classes, attending violin events, attending concerts, of course, Ron also took courses on violin making and became quite good. From the very first violin, really, that he made, I saw them in the white. I saw them as he was varnishing them. So he took up this hobby late in life after he had retired, pretty much, I think. Produced a number of violins, and quite good sound, these violins. He also made his own wooden music stand. He was a talented painter, an artist, and also got a gold medal in acting. So, you know, just very good in the arts in general, but also took massage courses, so varying interests. An extensive collection of violin books with current and back issues of the Strad magazine going way back to the 60s. A huge collection of CDs and vinyls, including some 78 RPMs, I believe. And obviously, Ron was a massive Heifetz fan. He almost got to see Jascha Heifetz in concert. This was in London in the 60s, but at the last minute, Heifetz cancelled. So that was the, I guess, one of the big regrets, that Ron was that close to seeing Heifetz perform the Beethoven, I think it was going to be, in London, and Heifetz took ill and cancelled, or whatever happened. It was around about that time. There was a lot of weird stuff happening with Charles Manson, and people were feeling unsafe in LA at the time. But anyway, that concert got cancelled. Apparently the queues were going right round the festival hall. Ron had his ticket, so he was going to get in there and see Heifetz, but it never happened, sadly. But he did like listening to a lot of Heifetz recordings and cross-comparing them with other recordings. He had he was interested in many other violins as well, of course. Not such a huge fan of Yehudi Menuhin, although he did appreciate the early Menuhin recordings. Excellent at music reading, leading orchestras, conducting. He didn't manage to study the Bach with Campoli. He knew the Bach sonatas and partitas, but didn't study them with Campoli. He studied the Paganini caprices with Campoli because the lessons with Campoli had ended at that point, even though Ron maintained contact with Campoli, as mentioned. When Ron was going to lessons with Alfredo Campoli, this was when Campoli lived in London, I believe, and Campoli had a large house with a raised platform in the living room, I guess, for the piano accompanist, with a Steinway piano in it. But later Campoli moved to Thame, where he is buried, I believe. Ron was full of stories about Jascha Heifetz. Also heard some of these stories firsthand from Isolde Menges. Campoli suffered from a little bit of professional jealousy of Heifetz, as is the case with a number of violinists who are lesser players than Heifetz, as great as they were themselves. So there we are. And Campoli had Heifetz, of course, had wrist vibrato, and I think Ron had adopted a wrist vibrato. But Campoli insisted that he learn... Sorry, let me start that again. Heifetz had arm vibrato, and Ron had adopted arm vibrato. But Campoli was a pro wrist vibrato, insisted that Ron learn wrist vibrato, made him learn that. And so in a way that was good, because Ron then was able to use wrist and arm vibrato both, which I think is a good skill to have. But obviously you will have a natural vibrato, which will be usually either one or the other. Eventually Campoli terminated the lessons with Ron, and I think it had to do something to do with Ron commenting about Heifetz being good at something or other, which I think was the final straw for Campoli. But the lessons had continued for a number of years, and they still remained in touch. Ron had a William Hesketh violin, and I think at the time, in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, was worth around £10,000, so, or more maybe, so quite a good violin. William Hesketh, I remember the name, and a number of expensive bows. Sadly, these were all stolen from Ron's flat, and I think quite tragically his insurance had just expired, and he'd not gotten around to renewing his insurance, which was sort of slightly careless on Ron's part, and for which he paid dearly. So those the violin and the bows were gone for good, and it was a very painful thing for Ron. Eventually moved out of that estate and bought a different house in another part of Milton Keynes. So after that, Ron commissioned violins from a violin from Rex, England, a local self-taught and highly gifted luthier from Milton Keynes, a real gentleman, Rex, England. And of course, Ron was making his own violins, and I think he'd bought another violin before he got the violin from Rex, England. Yeah. Of course, he played on a number of different Strads and bits and pieces throughout his violin adventures over the years. Ron had a great sense of humour and was always cracking jokes. He was also a keen traveller, well-travelled, and after retirement continued to travel extensively. When I would turn up for a lesson, Ron would never start the lesson straight away. Once we'd become reacquainted, become friends, because obviously I've known Ron all my life, but only really became sort of close friends with him in my early 20s when I returned for lessons with him. And so once the lessons had moved back to his private home, at that point, Ron had purchased a lovely new detached home near the fire station in Milton Keynes. We'd never start lessons straight away, but we'd always start off with a lengthy chat. He would insist on giving me food and coffee, and then eventually we'd move on to the lesson. Sometimes I'd actually be a little bit tired by the time we reached the lesson, because obviously I was turning up to Ron's after work in the evening once a week. Anyway, things we would talk about. We would compare notes on films. Ron introduced me to Satyajit Ray and some of the French neo-realist films and the golden era of Hollywood. He knew about all the movie stars, David Niven and all these people. And then I managed to introduce him to Manon des Sources and Jean de Florette and Manon des Sources, the French films. So we compared notes, and in fact, Ron related a story of, in those films, the César, he dies of a broken heart at the end of the film, but Ron related how that had happened to his aunt's maid back in Goa, where she'd lived with the aunt, a rich aunt who had a big house, and the maid had lived with her all her life, and then when the lady died, she died shortly after of a broken heart. So a real phenomenon. So we talked about all kinds of things, very intellectual topics, and obviously music and Heifetz and Grumio and Oistrakh and all these guys. Kreisler, all the violinists, listening to recordings, him playing me recordings of Campoli, telling me stuff about Campoli. I'd say that Ron tended to distance himself from his Indian roots, but he did appreciate certain things about India, such as yoga, Satyajit Ray, obviously, the Indian mango. Then eventually he had, I think, given up going to India, became fed up of going there. Didn't go back to Goa very much in the time that I became reacquainted with him. Had a property in Spain, but had a bad experience with it, so I got rid of that. Ron was a keen gardener, always had a very, very nice garden, put mine to shame, and would give me tips and ideas about my garden. And that reminds me a little bit of Heifetz. On one of the videos of Heifetz, you can see the footage where his students are helping him tend his garden, his roses that he has. So yeah, having a wide range of interests. Ron was quite small in stature, not tall, but that's true of a number of violinists like Ricci and Elman. It doesn't affect the playing in any way. And here's where Ron's story ends, I guess. He died in late 2009, Boxing Day, and I believe he died whilst performing on stage. Had a heart attack. That's the story I heard. So, doing what he loved best. I'd since moved out of Milton Keynes. My lessons had ceased in 2006 when I moved to Coventry. So I'd first gone to Ron when I was 4, returned to him when I was 23, and then stayed with him sort of between 2000 and 2006, those years. Studied with him through those years, and until I moved out of Milton Keynes. Ron was more of a Radio 3 guy than a Classic FM guy. He liked all the old world players. He had got hold of the Heifetz masterclasses on VHS and made copies for me. Allowed me to borrow his 46 CD collection, the Heifetz RCA collection. Gave me the promotional poster of Heifetz, which I still have in cardboard. From that, lots of cuttings for my violin scrapbook, which Ron encouraged me to keep as he did, as well as giving me back issues of the Strad magazine, helping me to obtain violins and bows. We also attended a number of concerts together, including Perlman, Mullova and Vengerov, the Vengerov Masterclass at the Royal Academy, the BVA, British Violin Association event at the Royal Academy. We also saw Vengerov perform during the masterclass, so I think he'd managed to obtain that tickets to that event, which was kind of a special event, through his nephew working at the Russian embassy or something like that. We were quite privileged to be able to go to that Vengerov masterclass and listen in on that, watching him coaching advanced students and then ultimately giving a performance. We would go to the Wigmore Hall, the Festival Hall, the Albert Hall, the Milton Keynes Theatre, the Barbican. So Ron really for me was that link to old world playing. An intellectual where the conversation was wide-ranging. Topics from India to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre to travel, politics, Tony Benn, and of course the great world of the violin. So I have a few little bits of memorabilia from Ron which I'll talk about next. So with all the stories that Ron told me, I'm glad that I wrote a few of these things down. So Sascha Lasserson, of course, he was in the Leopold Auer class with Jascha Heifetz, a friend of Heifetz. Ron had phoned him for lessons, but he passed away before Ron could meet him. Isolde Menges, Heifetz teacher, she was also in the Leopold Auer class. She told the story of Heifetz with the ball, which I've made another video on. You can find that in my music playlist, and said that Heifetz was something else and played the Bach for Ron brilliantly, even though she had bad arthritis. She said she was glad she would die soon, as there were no good violinists left. I think there were. There's Perlman and Zuckerman and others, but she said that all violinists sounded the same these days. So Stanislav Friedberg was another teacher of Ron's that Ron went to for lessons. So he was the horse breeder. I've made a mistake in one of my other videos because I thought Sascha Lasserson was the horse breeder, so I have to correct that. Renowned for detuning the violin and playing in tune. Russian Jew, lived in Belgravia. I think this was his teacher, but I can't remember what that was. Max Jaffa, pupil of Lasserson. Not quite sure how Ron knew him. Zabludow. No. This is Ron's teacher. Okay. Mozart specialist, Ron's teacher, used to fold the banknotes very carefully. But he was a Menuhin fan, not a Heifetz fan. Have to be careful what you say about Heifetz then in front of him. Alfredo Campoli, Ron's teacher, not a Heifetz fan, said that Heifetz had a mechanical heart and poker face and all that, but did own Heifetz 78 RPMs and played in the orchestra for the famed Scottish fantasy performance with Malcolm Sargent. Like leather. Yeah, so if Ron made a mistake, he would say, "You're like leather," and pointed to the sole of his shoe. His father was a violinist in Rome who played scales on his deathbed and broke bows over Campoli's back. I made a few stories and video stories about that. Colin Sawyer, Ron's teacher, and a Heifetz fan in this case. Heifetz cold? No way. White heat. Guy who played during Vengroff masterclass session played César Franck Sonata. I don't know why that's under Colin Sawyer, but anyway. Ruggiero Ricci. Ron attended masterclasses in Dartington. Stories about Heifetz being stingy with the whiskey, pouring him just a small glass. This doesn't really fit with Heifetz, and probably again a bit of professional jealousy going on. Ron and I didn't really believe that story was too true. Grinka, Canadian violinist who examined Ron for the LRAM diploma. Zubin Mehta was in Ron's class at school in Goa, conductor. When conducting Heifetz, he remarked to his violinist father, Meli Mehta, "I am conducting God." So when he had the news that he was going to conduct Heifetz, I must dig out what recording that is. He phoned his dad and said, "Guess what? I'm conducting God." I need to research who this Stanislav Friedberg guy was. Was he the guy who Heifetz went to see? Was he Heifetz friend? I can't remember. Axelrod wrote the Heifetz book, Violin Dealer. He said Van Groff's going off the boil. Rosenberg, Violin Dealer. Tommaso So. Saw him at the Van Groff masterclass. Oskar Shumsky remarked to Ron, "I'm not a bow crank." Chrysler, "What do you think of my child's execution?" That would be a good idea. That was when someone got their kid to perform for Chrysler and it was terrible. Heifetz imitated his playing for his birthday behind the stage curtain. There was a birthday concert that Heifetz played at. Hugh Bean, Heifetz fan, popped the top off his Stradivarius with his bow during a performance. This was a loaned violin. Was drunk at the time. Oops. Ida Handel used as her Strad as a prop to climb onto the stage and threw Ron's notebook on the floor as was frustrated with a pen not working. Bit of a feisty old spinster. So that story of her grabbing her violin by the scroll and using it to climb up on the stage, that was something that Ron saw, was quite surprised by. Joseph Hasid, London-based player, died of brain tumour. Oh yeah, I remember him. Joseph Hasid, yeah. Flame extinguished too early. Jeanette Neveu, French player, pupil of Carl Flesch, died in a plane crash. Manouk Perikian. Okay, there's just some bits and bobs gleaned from Ron. This is sadly the only photograph I have of Ron from when I was 4. So if you have any photos of Ron de Lima, you could somehow add a link to as a comment on this YouTube video, that would be greatly appreciated. And it's just been good for me to pay tribute to my old teacher. It was a great influence on me, and to recall these memories of Ron. Fantastic individual, dedicated to the world of the violin. Ciao for now.